We have a massive bureaucracy in Canada who don't know what they're doing, not executing policy the way that they should be. I think there needs to be massive structural reforms to our broader public service. A country that has 51% of its population employed by the broader public service is destined to fail. It's as simple as that. Because it's one thing for the government to set the policy of peers in there, but you have this massive entrenched, primarily liberal, left-leaning bureaucracy who's going to fight tooth and nail to resist those changes. So we need to remember that that's part of the equation here as well.
Welcome to the Thought Leader Revolution with Nikki Ballou. Join the revolution. There's never been a better time in history to speak your truth, find your freedom, and make your fortune. Each week, we interview the world's top thought leaders and learn the secrets of how they built a 6 to 7 figure practice. This episode has been brought to you by eCircleacademy.com, the proven system to add 6 to 7 figures a year to your thought leader practice.
Welcome to another exciting episode of the podcast, The Thought Leader Revolution. I'm your host, Nikki Ballou. And boy, do we have an exciting guest lined up for you today. Today's guest has a unique distinction. He's the only fellow that I've ever interviewed on the show that had the technology blow up and the entire interview disappeared. And it was an incredible interview. And, you know, he's been such a good sport about it that we decided to do it again. I'm speaking, of course, of none other than the one, the only, the legendary Ian Robertson. Welcome in.
Thank you for having me, Nikki.
So, brother, for the benefit of the folks who did not get to listen to your amazing introduction when you and I originally did it, tell us your backstory. How'd you get to be the great Ian Robertson?
Well, you're too kind. I have to humbly say there is no great Ian Robertson. There's just a bunch of people who I worked for who helped me have a successful career. I have two distinct chapters to my 25-year-long career now. The first one I spent working in politics, started working out for a really great leader, Mike Harris, working with his cabinet, a number of leaders there. I've worked for basically every conservative or reform leader over the last 20 years in some shape or form. I grew up cutting my teeth on the books and the leadership of Preston Manning, followed the Mike Harris legacy, the Stephen Harper legacy, Brian Mulroney, all of those guys. I pivoted in about 15 years ago, had an opportunity on Bay Street. I developed what I thought was a completely useless skill set in politics, which was I was able to convince people to vote a certain way. And what I realized was there was a need for that in the capital markets, doing proxy fights, hostile takeholder, shareholder activism. So I spent the last 15 years working on Bay Streets with CEOs and boards of directors. And in both of those chapters of my life, what I found was a couple of things. Number one, it's the same pattern of predictable and preventable problems if the leaders only had the capacity and foresight to get their hands around those. So what my skill set has sort of developed over the years is two things. Number one, helping de-risk problems. In politics, they said I was a fixer. I just looked at myself as a guy who liked to try and help out when there was complex problems that need solving. And on the flip side of that is a lot of leaders just don't have the bandwidth or capacity to really think through the challenging issues that they have on their plates because of the volume that's coming at them these days. So I try and help leaders sharpen their decision making and accelerate the decisions that they make and make them better.
I like it. So let's unpack a bit of this.
Sure.
What made you decide to get into politics in the first place? How'd you get connected to Mike Harris back in the mid-90s?
Well, I'm probably an outlier. I came from a family of teachers, and I married into a family of teachers. So you can imagine in the mid-1990s, you had Ontario was going down the drain. Ontario had suffered through 4 or 5 years of the Bob Rae NDP government, where, I saw in that period when they were elected in 1990, a lot of promise, a lot of hope that was delivered to people. And just like every utopian vision, it turns out to be a myth, a lie, and in practice, everything falls apart. I became a teenager when there was massive unemployment, a lot like today, right? Affordability was a challenge. And when I looked at things and sort of looked at the landscape, I wasn't partisan. I was inspired by ideas. And when I looked at the very common sense ideas that Mike Harris and his team were putting out, it just made sense to me. It made sense to me that at the end of the day, the closer you can put decision making and economic power to the individual and allow them more freedom of enterprise, the more successful you're going to be as a society. So that resonated with me. I started out banging in lawn signs. My first one went on my parents' lawn, and they still tell the story when they came home from teaching, and there was a Mike Harris lawn sign on their front porch. At the same time, the teachers' union were rallying to stop them.
That's pretty wild. That's pretty wild. That's awesome. Okay, so talk about why you think Harris got elected, because the NDP government of Ontario was the first time Ontario had elected an NDP government. It was an absolute shocker. Nobody expected David Peterson's government to be defeated by the NDP. And when Bob Rae got in, I don't think anyone was more shocked than Rae himself. And he proceeded to absolutely destroy Ontario's economy. And the Tories in that election in 1990 had come in third, right? The NDP came first, the Liberals came in second, and the Tories came third. So how was it that in 5 short years, Mike Harris was able to turn the tables and defeat the Socialists under Bob Rae and bring happy days to Ontario again?
Well, look, I think this is a timely conversation. I think there's many analogous situations to where Canada finds itself right now. So, number one, I think, as I said, the myth of this utopian society that can be created by these socialist ideologies was exposed to be a myth, right? You didn't have, growing wealth for everybody. You actually had shrinking wealth. There was not employment for everyone. There was employment for very few. So step one was to have that myth exposed and the reality start to set in on people. I think, in 1995, what it became then a choice was the NDP. It was not the NDP, but between the Liberals and the Conservatives. And if you look at the polls, pretty much right up until the end, it was the Liberals are going to win. But what I think people weren't seeing was three things. Number one, the Conservatives under Mike Harris had a very simple message, right? Which was common sense for a change, right? They're going to change things by making common sense decisions and putting individual people back in control of their lives. One of the reference points that they used for that was workfare. So there was a lot of money going out the door under the NDP to support the social welfare state. Unemployed people were getting paid more than some working people. So the Conservatives made that a focal point of their campaign, and that became a wedge issue. Workfare became a wedge issue that really said, whose side is this government going to be on? Is it going to be on the side of the working people, or is it going to be on the side of the lazy people who take the wealth from others? So that became a really great focal point. The second thing is Mike Harris, in the way he communicated, was very clear, consistent. He spoke truth. A lot of the message he had to deliver were not comfortable ones. People weren't going to like them. He was going to have to do a lot of unpopular things. And I remember hearing polling and looking at stuff around that time, and he got credit because he was being honest with the people of the situation they're in and the steps that were going to be taken to change that around. And then the third thing is Mike did a really good job of recruiting an excellent class of candidates around him, right? So it was about making sure that you have people who were not from government for government, but having real people with real experience who can take government and turn it around. One of the quotes I have many Mike Harris, I wouldn't even call them quotes, but tidbits of knowledge I've learned from him over the years. One of them was that when you start acting like the government you are elected to replace, it's time for you to go. So that was always inspiring to me. And I've always said, I'm in politics, I'm not in government.
Yeah, man. I really like that. I remember that time very, very well. I lived at Yonge and Davisville then, and the Tory candidate came to my door, and I recognized him from his signs. He was the former chair of the TTC. I think his name was, I forget, Al Davis or something. And he was an older guy. And as soon as he knocked on the door and I opened it, I said his name, and he said, "You know who I am?" I go, "Yeah, I'm voting for you, man. I'm all over you." And he was like so shocked because I guess he had to have a lot of conversation to try to convince people in the building. I said, you got to win. I wasn't in Ontario in 1990. I was in university doing my master's at Georgetown in Washington. And I was shocked that we had elected an NDP government. Absolutely shocked. Flabbergasted, as a matter of fact. And I said, no, we've got to get these bastards out of here because they are the devil. I mean, socialists, in my opinion, are the Antichrist and the devil. And I don't think it's as simple as they're just, folks who are well-meaning, but their ideas are misguided. I don't think that. I used to think that. I don't think that anymore. And Mike Harris was able to go from being third place in the polls to winning that election because he came across as being honest. He came across as being ready to tell the hard truths that people didn't want to hear necessarily. And yeah, I remember workfare was a huge issue. And the other thing that was an absolutely huge issue was the fact that for the first time in Canadian history, at least since I'd been alive, most of the key recruits were people who were business people. I remember Al Palladini. You remember Al Palladini? Andy Palladini's a pal of mine. Was a commercial that he used to run on the radio all the time. And you had other folks that were serious business people. John Snowbelin, folks like that. They came in and they wanted to do good. This was actually a step down for them in life to be a politician, where most of the people that were running for the NDP and the Liberals, this was a step up. They were going to make more money by getting elected. So it was a beautiful thing. The time where Mike Harris was in charge of Ontario, I think, was the greatest period of governance in my lifetime in Ontario. And I'm just wondering, do you believe that right now Pierre Poilievre is taking a page out of Mike Harris's book? And if so, how's he doing it? And if he's not, in which ways is he not?
I don't think it's the right way to look at it is Pierre taking a page out of Mike Harris's book, right? Pierre and Mike are both taking a page out of the people's book and looking what they need and then having the courage to speak to it. So I know the left has started to, push this idea that, Pierre is populist, right? They were saying the same thing about Harris and Pierre's MAGA. Well, he's not. He's just the first guy to show up and actually read the room correctly, right? Which is that, people are struggling day to day. Affordability, housing, energy, productivity, right? These are the kinds of problems that people are actually dealing with. And I know the left has started to really push back and attack Pierre for still focusing on those when they want to be talking exclusively about tariffs. But that's because they know that those are losing issues for him, right? And they don't have a solution to any of those things. To me, the question here is, it's part about this election, but it's more about who's going to be able to rebuild Canada, whoever the next leader is. I mean, we've been so debilitated by this Carney and Trudeau model of stakeholder capitalism, where you basically cede growth and every opportunity to a centralized regulatory body to make decisions. To turn our economy back around, you need clarity of focus to really understand that tough decisions need to be made and the courage to do them quickly. The thing that I see in Pierre that I saw in Mike is what I call clarity of focus. There is a very clear viewpoint on what needs to be done, but more importantly, the timeline and the expediency which it needs to be done with. Mike had a great quote, which was to the effect of, by the time we're done, every blade of grass on the front lawn of Queen's Park is going to be trampled by protesters. And he didn't say that as a way to make a joke about it, but the reality was we're going to have to do a lot of unpopular things. We're going to have to cut a lot of spending, especially the popular spending. But if we want to turn Ontario around, that's what's required. I think Pierre's willing to do that. I think he's the kind of leader who has not only the courage, but the clarity of focus to make that happen. One other thing I just say is you mentioned the socialist ideology and approach. And what I've observed about this throughout history is that elites, particularly on the left-hand side of the political spectrum, have a trick. And the trick is that they try and make the system so complex that the average person who's overworked, underpaid, and exhausted just stops trying to understand it. I mean, if you look back through history, I mean, Egyptian priesthoods would hide meaning in hieroglyphs. Medieval clergy would be chanting in Latin so the average person couldn't understand it. When I look at what's happening now, you have Mark Carney and Trudeau and all of these technocrats, spitting acronyms coming out of Davos. And what I see is the average person is so confused. They don't know the right questions to ask. And the consequence of that is the elite who are in charge are empowered by that. What Mike Harris did, and I think Pierre is doing a good job, is cutting through that, simplifying the problems and the challenges. Our problems are not so complex that we aren't able to fix them, right? The system that the left tends to use is actually brilliant. It deflects scrutiny by design, because if you're struggling to keep up day to day, you won't have the mental bandwidth to decode, climate index bond structures and, integrated ESG reporting. And if you're exhausted, you're just not going to start protesting how the game's rigged against you. And when I look at this election, a lot of people have said, Canadians are apathetic and they're not engaging. I just think Canadians are overwhelmed. And this is what I'm really concerned about, because against that backdrop, Carney arrives not as a man of the people, but a man who understands how the system works because he helped structure it. And I think the temptation for a lot of voters is going to be, they're weary from economic whiplash, is to equate that incomprehensibility on economics with expertise and put a guy like him in charge, when that's actually the opposite of what Canada needs.
I don't think the voters are going to do that. I think the voters are smarter than that. I think there's people who are primarily liberal leaning who couldn't stand Trudeau, and with him being out, some of those have come back to the fold. I don't see a big drop off of support for Pierre. Pierre's support has been in that 39 to 44% range throughout. I don't know anybody personally who said, oh, Carney's in, well, I'm not going to vote for Pierre anymore. I just don't think that's a thing. It may be like anecdotally, there's a few examples of that, but I just don't think that's a thing. I also think that the Canadian people right now are very concerned about the future of this country. And the truth of the matter is, most Canadians that are younger can no longer afford the Canadian dream. If you're a baby boomer and you already own your own house, you're in good shape because, supporting Carney isn't going to really hurt you too much, right? Your assets are valued at a pretty high level. You're hopeful that Carney isn't going to damage them too much. You're going to be able to sell your house and have a nice nest egg and buzz off somewhere down south and live out your retirement years. You're all good if that's something you want to do. But for folks that are under the age of 50, the Canadian dream is not something that they see being within their grasp. And I don't think those folks are going to be taken in by the Carney lies for one moment. I think that the polls right now are being skewed deliberately in a particular way to dishearten the right so that we won't push hard to get rid of the liberals. That's what they tried to do in the United States when Kamala Harris took over for Joe Biden. Joe Biden was losing to Donald Trump and losing badly. Kamala comes in. All of a sudden, the polls go up. Oh, my God, look, Kamala, everybody loves Kamala. But I'm going, I don't know anybody who loves Kamala. Nobody thinks Kamala's great. I don't know anybody who loves Carney. Nobody thinks Carney's great. Now, is he smarter than Trudeau? Yeah. Is he smarter than Kamala? Sure. But is he somebody with a massive following? Heck no, not at all. And those commercials he made with Mike Myers, a man who is now admittedly an American citizen and pretending to be a Canadian, are a joke. They're an absolute joke. What I think the Canadian people are seeing about Pierre is that he is honest Mike. We had honest Mike. Now we have honest Pierre. He's telling the truth, the hard truths that the people need to hear. I think he's doing that. And there's an authenticity to him. He doesn't come across as a typical politician. Even though he's been a politician for 20 years, he doesn't come across as a typical politician. And if you look at the rallies that he's been hosting across the country, he's been getting huge turnout for them. This is kind of like Trump rallies in the US. And I'm looking at these rallies and I'm going, you're telling me Pierre, who's drawing between 4,000 and 10,000 people to each of his rallies, which for Canada is unprecedented, is going to lose to this dry, boring, lying banker who's being more and more exposed as the days goes on? I just don't see it. Your comments, your thoughts.
Yes, I got a bunch of thoughts on this. Your comment about Mike Myers kind of goes back to what I was saying about, the elites creating this system, this structure. I was reminded of, if you've ever seen the Hunger Games, Cornelius Snow presides over, to do depressed conditions for the populace, and he sits above the crowd as the game maker, and he has, in my mind, if that's Carney, he's got Greta Thunberg on one side and Mike Myers on the other, and it's all about distraction, right? It's distraction. It's don't focus on what this is really about. It's distract the people and get through. The equation that's a problem, and I've been heard on so many conservative campaigns because of this, is that the NDP again aren't living up to their side of the bargain, right? They simply need to get to sort of 15, 16%, and they're not doing that. The consequences.
14, man. The latest poll I saw is the NDP's at 14%.
They got to get it up higher, even at 2 more points, right? And what's the consequence of that? Well, why is that happening? Well, Jagmeet has propped these guys up for years, right? It helped to manage the decline of Canada. It was very transparent in terms of why he did that, so he could get his pension. But they have brought forward no new ideas. They've brought forward a very poor set of candidates. So all of these issues help contribute to the Liberals bolstering their support on the left. They've also, the Liberals are fighting a 3-way war because they also have to deal with the Bloc in Quebec. When I look at the numbers and stuff, you mentioned the polling. What I always looked at was first thing is there's a view amongst some pollsters, and I subscribe to this, that conservative voters are usually underrepresented because they're actually at work. They have busy lives, right? They're blue collar. They don't have time to pick up the polls and comment on stuff, right? They're also highly suspicious. So there's a little bit of a theoretical discount you can put into the polling model as part of
3%. 3%.
Yeah. But I also know that conservative voters, and this is why Mike was so successful at winning, was because he would turn out the base portion of the conservatives at a higher rate than others. So a lot of this is going to come down to GoTV and who can actually turn out their vote, who's passionate and motivated at the end of it. And what I look at as an early indicator for that is not only the early polls, but also the dollars. Where's the money going, right? And by that calculation, the Conservatives are doing very well. Lots of donations are going forward. Of course, Carney has had, his elite technocrats step up once he was elected and his banker buddies. But that's just like $1 from a bunch of wealthy people. If you look at what the Conservatives have done over the last few years, I think they've really built a war chest based on individual motivation. And historically, that turns into votes. I don't know anybody who's passionate about Carney. I do know a lot of people who are passionate about the Conservatives. And I think that's going to translate into people actually turning out to vote on election day.
I think that's going to happen in a big way. And I think that conservatives are going to come out and vote early too. I got a bunch of emails from the conservative brain trust saying, bank your vote now, bank your vote now. And I'm probably going to do that. I'm probably going to go and vote early and get it done. I went on Rebel News. I was interviewed by Ezra Levant. I think the interview is coming out today, fingers crossed. And I made the case to the Rebel News base, which many of whom are likely PPC voters. And in fact, I got to tell you, for the first time in the last election, I voted for the PPC because I was disgusted with Aaron O'Toole. I thought he and there was no daylight between him and Justin whatsoever. But I just think that voting for the PPC this time risks electing the Liberals to a 4th term. And as much as I love Max, I think he's great. And I think it's important that he's there and he's forcing the Conservatives to be more conservative, which I think is a good thing. The Overton window is moved because of him. This is too important an election for people to waste their votes. It just is. And that's why I went on Rebel News and I said, hey, guys, I know you are a little disappointed in the Tories, and I can appreciate that, but now's not the time. Now's the time to find out who your 80%, 90% friend is. You don't have to have the Tories agree with you 100% of the time, but if they agree with you 80, 90% of the time, if they're about tightening up bail laws so that criminals don't get put back on the street the very day after they murder people and rape people, if you're about tightening up the border so American guns don't come into Toronto, if you're about axing the carbon tax, if you're about reducing income taxes by 15%, if you're about an extra $5,000 in the TFSA because you're ready to invest that money in Canadian corporations, if you're about building pipelines so we don't have to rely on the United States being our one and only major international customer, and we can start to have them be one of several big customers. If all of those make sense to you, Pierre Poilievre's your guy, because Pierre Poilievre's actually got a chance of being the next prime minister, and Max Bernier does not. He has admitted he's not going to be elected prime minister this time. He understands that. And he's attacking Pierre pretty hard. And I appreciate that. This is politics. You got to try to make your point and draw distinctions between you and the other guys. And that's his job. And we can't fault him for that. But what we can do is we can talk to a lot of his supporters and say, hey, guys, maybe this time, if instead of 6% of the vote going to PPC, 3.5% goes to the PPC, and 2.5% of that goes to the Conservatives, that can be the difference between a fourth Liberal term and a Conservative government that will honestly put Canada first and make Canada great again. And I think it's ridiculous to call Pierre a MAGA guy. MAGA is about America. It's make America great again. Pierre is about make Canada great again, if you want to say that. So, he says Canada first. So it's ridiculous to call him a MAGA guy. And I think the Liberals really, they need to shut up about their supposed patriotism, because there's nothing patriotic about how they've governed this country for the last 9.5 years. Quite the opposite. In fact, I think it's borderline treasonous what they've done to Canada. Your comments.
Yeah, the whole idea that Pierre is a radical, that the left started to push that. I mean, he's not proposing some sort of, far right revolution. He's simply proposing a return to reality. And I guess right now that's radical enough for some people, given the state that we're in.
He's a middle of the road conservative, buddy.
Yeah. It's, when I look at sort of the trajectory of this campaign, first of all, the reality is most people are not paying attention to this campaign yet, the way that you and I are. And I think the Conservatives have the right message. I think they just need to stay disciplined, stay focused on what actually matters. Because if you look back through the polling, right, tariffs suddenly spiked for obvious reasons. But the pocketbook issues that he's been talking about for 3-4 years, they remain there, right? Those are going to exist after the tariff issue goes off the front pages. They're going to be actually probably worsened after that, right? So I think he's got the right message. He's staying focused. The polls will break in the final couple of days. That always happens. Everyone likes to put a big spotlight on the debates. This is going to be an interesting debate because, first of all, you have 5 people up there, 2 of which probably have no business actually being on the stage. I'm not sure what Jagmeet's actually going to be adding to this conversation. But when you look at the contrast between Pierre and Carney, I think you're going to see a couple of things. Number one, Pierre is going to be a straight talker. He is going to speak to the person at home and tell them some unpopular truths. But if you're willing to make some tough decisions, there's hope at the end of the rainbow. And I think that's going to go a long way. Carney, on the other hand, is going to preach, right? His model is to preach and explain why his ideas, why centralized authority, why that is the right way to go. And I don't think that's going to come over well. The second thing is Pierre's an experienced political operative. He's an experienced political debater. I first met Pierre when I was 22 in university. This is a guy who is very adept at explaining complex ideas simply, and also not letting left-wing politicians advance arguments on false premises. So I personally am looking forward to the debate. I think Pierre is going to destroy Carney. I think Carney is going to, trip over his complexity and get exposed. I say this not to be an alarmist or extremist, but I think that a lot of the ideas that Carney is putting forward are very, very, very dangerous to Canada. If you look at this model of stakeholder capitalism that he's been advancing for years, along with the World Economic Forum, if you've ever read his book, Values, it's very clear that he does not believe in a capitalist market where there is opportunity and free choice. His model is to centralize control, limit opportunity, and distribute it as he sees fit. And I think that is very, very dangerous for Canadians. If they say, okay, well, you know what, let's forget the people and look at the policy ideas. I mean, what I've seen Carney put out, it's a formula to manage the continued decline of Canada. The issues that he's co-opted from Pierre because he knows they're popular and the right thing to do, those aren't enough to fundamentally change the direction of the country. It's enough to maybe get him the election, but it's not enough to actually change the trajectory of the country. And that's what I'm worried about, and I hope people really look at is what are the economic ideas that are going to drive this. So when you look at the CPC, this is what this brings me to. As again, I've been in the party for over 30 years. I am always astounded and disappointed at our ability to fight amongst the family and trip over ourselves to get something done, going all the way back to when Preston Manning was trying to advance things federally. So what does that mean? Well, I think a lot of the divides on the right side of the political spectrum tend to fall on social ideology. The way I look at this and where I think Canada is we don't have the luxury of debating a lot of these things right now. We have to get our economy turned around, allow individuals the opportunity to participate in a growing and prosperous society. And you do so under the belief that the best thing we can do to take care of social interests of everybody else is to create growing wealth and individual choice and individual opportunity for people. So on that basis, when you look at the CPC, I would say, you know what, the best way to get where you're going is to get a conservative government in place as quickly as possible.
I agree. So here's the quote from Carney's book, Values. Western society is morally rotten and it has been corrupted by capitalism. This requires rigid controls of personal freedoms, industry, and corporate funding. This is not a promise to make the lives of ordinary people better, but temporarily worse. This will be a world of severely constrained choice, less flying, less meat, more inconvenience, and temporarily more poverty. Assets will be stranded, gasoline cars will be unsellable, and inefficient properties will be unrentable. Mark Carney, in his book Values, Building a Better World for All. This is Mao Zedong in a central banker's guise. This is a call to arms for everyone who believes in freedom to push this son of a bitch out of politics once and for all and return Canada to the hands of some good old-fashioned middle-of-the-road conservative like Pierre Poilievre. To call him far-right is absolutely insane. You know, to me, Elon Musk is a left of center. I've always thought him to be a left of center guy. You know, it's mind-boggling to me that right now they're saying he's, you know, a crazy far-right guy. He's not, man. This guy is the most pro climate change, environmental agenda guy that there is. He's done more to bring the green agenda to life than anyone in history. I actually don't agree with that. I actually think what he's doing is wrong, even though I invested in Tesla because I think he's a brilliant businessman. But if you're calling Elon Musk a far-right individual, that says something to me about how crazy far-left loon you are and you think. And I'm just wondering what your comments are on that, in particular as it pertains to Pierre Poilievre.
Well, let me go back to your quote that you had from Values and the comparison to, you know, Marxist and socialism. The difference here, and this is not a good difference, the original, communist socialist experiment required the government to seize the means of production, right? Take over the means of production to control society. Stakeholder capitalism's model does the same thing. But rather than actually physically taking control of the means of productions, they've created regulatory and ideological capture over the people who control the means of production. And that's in many ways more dangerous. It's harder to recognize, it's harder to control. If you think about how that is done, it's there's two levers the government uses. Number one, and this is totally true in Canada, just reflect on your own experience if you're a business person, is on the incentive side, you can only be a successful growing business in Canada if you take subsidies. Like that is a reality. You've got to get government handouts to be successful because the government has used ESG and social policy to restrict the normal levers of growth. Energy policy being a prime example, right? All of that's been restricted under the stakeholder capitalism model. On the other side of that, there's a punitive measure the government uses, which is we live in such a massively regulated country that anyone who would think about stepping out of line is going to get a slap on the wrist from the regulators. And if they don't get a slap on the wrist, anything that they want to do is going to get hamstrung and blocked, right? Bill C-69 is a prime example. Nothing is ever going to get built in Canada again under these principles. So when I look at it from this perspective, I don't think that it's very extreme to liken the vision that Carney has to some of the greatest socialists our world has ever seen.
The most notorious, you mean, because there's nothing great about a socialist.
That's true. Point taken.
Stakeholder capitalism is just a new word and a fancy crypto word for fascism. This is how Hitler and Mussolini controlled the economies of Italy and Germany. If you go back and you study Italy in the 20s and Germany in the 30s, the governments in power there started to put ideologically friendly people in charge, and they basically told them that if they want to do business, they need to parrot the party line. And they did. They all did. Krupp did, IG Farben did, BMW did, all those major companies did, and they did the government's bidding. There's no such thing as stakeholder capitalism. It's another word for fascism. Mark Carney is a Mussolini-style fascist.
Well, look, here's what I would say. History always ends up the same way. So in every one of those examples you presented, central planning ideology is always destined to collapse on itself. And what happens is you can have a system that can't sustain itself. If you can't generate the wealth and the prosperity to sustain itself, it's destined to collapse. If you look at the last 10 years of what's happened in Canada, that's all the proof we need, right? We have stopped growing, right? We have stopped growing. We have chosen to lock up our natural competitive advantages, resources, energy in Canada. Those have all been shackled under this idea that we needed to be somehow have this moral capitalist mindset. But let's think about where we're really at on this. So first of all, stakeholder capitalism didn't spring from the minds of some free market economists, right? This was dreamed up by Charles Schultz and some Chinese, some other state capitalists at Davos. It's indoctrinated.
But dude, it was created by Benito Mussolini in 1923. Go read your history. Those guys stole it from him.
But they get the slogan to it. They put a nice new bumper sticker on it.
Right, because if you call it fascism, everyone's going to shun you. That's it. They had to change. They had to rebrand it. But they are Mussolini's ideas.
Yeah, and if you look, so this is really interesting, right? So if you look at this from the historic perspective, the world's polarizing. You have the state-centric models of the East, of Russia and China on one hand. You have the U.S. under the shareholder-in-chief trajectory going back to the shareholder-centric model and all the free market capitalism that comes with that. Canada, as a small, mid-sized economy, along with a couple other European nations, we simply can't survive under this model that's been proven not to work. So the question is, do we choose to evolve or I would say, return to the shareholder-centric model that built our country, or are we going to be pushed and prodded and pulled into a vacuum of state-centric capitalism because we're unwilling to stand up against these ideas? And when I look at that, the choice before voters this campaign, that's what this is about. It's about what type of economic structure do you want to exist in, not for the next 2 or 3 years, but I think if Carney wins and is able to entrench this model further in our bureaucracy and in our social institutions, it is going to be a 20-year turnaround Canada will have to get out of the hole he's going to put us in.
Well, listen, my family immigrated to Canada, and I'm a proud Canadian, but we know how to leave a country that's not working. And if we have to, we'll do it again. I'd rather not. I'd rather stay here. I love this country, but we escaped tyranny once. I'm not going to consign myself and my family to living under tyranny again, if that is the direction the country goes in. But we need to fight for what we have here. I think it's very important that Pierre Poilievre gets elected. I've given money to the party. I'm voting for him. I'm doing everything I can to convince people to vote conservative this time around. Um, Before we land the plane on this episode, I want to ask you about one thing that I think Pierre has not talked about enough, and that's the whole immigration and migration issue. Let's face it, Canada prior to Justin Trudeau had a very solid immigration system. We brought in really high level people into the country that would make the country better. Under Justin Trudeau, he's basically opened the floodgates, especially the last 4 years, and let in 1.2 million people a year, almost 5 million people in 4 years. That has been an absolutely massive increase in the size of our population. And I think it's part of what's driving the problems we have with unemployment and housing costs being out of control. And I wonder what your thoughts are on how Pierre needs to deal with this over the next few years if he gets elected prime minister.
Well, what you just described is proof point number one when social ideology trumps good economic policy, right? I think the model that I subscribe to, and I would hope the conservatives subscribe to, is let the economic needs of the country dictate our immigration practices. That's not about being, mean or picking and choosing who comes in. It is simply saying that to keep this a prosperous nation prosperous and continuing to advantage all who live here and all who want to come here, we need to take an economically principled view when we're constructing our immigration policy. It's very simple.
I immigrated here with my family. We had to agree to invest a certain amount of money in a Canadian business to be allowed here, and hire a certain number of Canadians to work for us. And we did that. That was what we had to do in order to be allowed to immigrate to Canada. I think that that's what immigrants ought to do. They ought to be people who are the best of the best. And all those folks who've come here on specious premises need to be sent back to their home country. And I think that's about 3.5 million people that are here on so-called student visas. We need to have the largest deportation program in Canadian history. And I think it's not a bad idea to put a moratorium on immigration for at least a year so we can just let only the very best of the best in. So, we'll make exceptions to it, and then we can open up immigration again. And yeah, we should be very much focused on who are we letting in. We should pick and choose who we allow into the country. Not everybody should get to come to Canada. One of the things that I think that Trump is doing that is brilliant is this whole gold card concept. You want to be an American citizen? Okay, you can pay $5 million for a gold card, and then you can become an American citizen. And it's a lot of money. They sold 1,000 of those in 24 hours. 1,000, that's $5 billion that went into the US Treasury. And the people that can afford to buy those gold cards are people who can afford to set up businesses here. And I think that's the sort of thing that might make sense for Canada to consider.
We started out by talking about the 1990s and what was going on in Canada at the time. And I remember when the NDP were in charge in Ontario, immigration was a big focal point, right? There was a lot of conversation about that led in part to the workfare policy Mike Harris had. And I remember thinking then, and I've seen this play out time and time again over cycles in history, is immigration comes to the forefront when there's limited opportunity, right? And it becomes, a way to point and say, well, they're coming in and they're taking our jobs. What I want Canada to be, and I think this is where Pierre can take us, is a country that is so full of opportunity that we need to open our doors even bigger to have the best and the brightest come in, because our economy is growing. We need those minds, and we want those people to have here. And I think that's part of the thing that Pierre doesn't get credit for, is he has a very hopeful vision of the future, a very hopeful vision for what Canada can be. Whereas, Carney's view seems to be we need to, bolster things, bolster the fences, lock things down. We need more structure and control, as opposed to saying we have a great country, great resources that have been tied up. We need to release the shackles and let our people in our country go.
I think that's definitely true. But if we don't get a handle on immigration and let in the right people into the country, I fear for the future of the country. You cannot just willy-nilly, like Europe did, open the floodgates and let anyone and everyone into the country. If you're bringing people into Canada, they need to assimilate to the Canadian system, the Canadian set of values. That was what we had to do. And I don't want people coming in here who are not going to adopt our values, who are not going to make this country a better place. I think that's a mistake. And there have been a lot of transnational criminal gangs that have brought people into the country, and basically they're robbing Canadians blind right now. And that's one of the things that Trudeau did that I'll never forgive him for. It's a terrible and horrible thing that's happened. And all of that, it's important that a conservative government say, look, yes, we're all for a hopeful future for Canada, but Canada for Canadians first. Let's get the country sorted out. And I think it's going to take 2 to 4 years to do that. And then we can look at who we let in and under what auspices.
Well, let's also distinguish here between the policy objectives and the actual implementation. We have a massive bureaucracy in Canada who don't know what they're doing. Probably are asleep at the switch on a lot of these issues, not executing policy the way that they should be. So whenever we're talking about like reforms and things that needs to change, I think there needs to be massive structural reforms to our broader public service. It's a country that has 51% of its population employed by the broader public service is destined to fail. It's as simple as that.
It is.
We need to deal with that, put accountability measures in place, because it's one thing for the government to set the policy if Pierre's in there, but you have this massive entrenched, primarily liberal, left-leaning bureaucracy who's going to fight tooth and nail to resist those changes. So we need to remember that that's part of the equation here as well.
I do remember that. And, one of the things that I think we need Canada's version of Doge. We need to come in there with somebody who has a stature in Canada as a serious businessman or businesswoman who's willing to step away from their business for a while and come in and reform our government and reform our public service. And that necessarily means cuts, large cuts that'll probably be somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 20% of the federal workforce. And I believe that there'll be a lot of hue and cry from the left on this, but it's the best thing that could happen for Canada. If the Americans could do it, if the Argentinians can do it under Javier Milei, there's no reason why we can't do it.
Yeah, this isn't a choice anymore. It's a necessity. We have a massive structural deficit that needs to be dealt with. I will disagree with you on one point, which is I don't like the idea of bringing in somebody else or striking an extra commission to deal with too much bureaucracy. My solution to this is to take a playbook, a page into the playbook from public corporations. And what that means is instill say-on-pay for cabinet, so that what they need to do for every cabinet minister in their ministry, they have specific targets and deliverables. Part of that would be cutting the public service. It's transparently measured. If they accomplish it, they get paid. If they don't, they get their pay cut. I guarantee you that will force reforms without
having zero pay. How about you get no pay if you don't accomplish it? That's what Warren Buffett said, that if you want the people in charge in Congress to get paid, they've got to keep spending to a certain level. And if they don't get paid. And he said, boy, would they be on top of that in a nanosecond.
Well, there's versions of it, but what I've learned throughout my career is performance follows the money, right? The dollars will incent the behaviors that you want. I'm always very, very worried by governments, especially conservative ones who get in with bold change agendas, because what tends to happen is cabinet ministers get co-opted by the bureaucracy in the early days. They get all these really big binders that tell them why it's harder to do the thing that they wanted to do. You couldn't actually do it.
Throw the binder away.
Yeah. Some ministers will say, hey, I have this really nice car and driver now, and maybe we don't need to go as fast. That's always the danger when you have these things. So, whatever the degree is, I think there's more transparency and aligned incentives are never a bad thing.
Amen. Ian Robertson, man, great to have you on the show. So if people want to find out more about you or get a hold of you, what's the best way?
You can check me out on LinkedIn or check out our website, which is jeffersonhawthorne.com.
Awesome. Ian, I got to tell you, this has been a fantastic conversation, different from the type of conversation I normally have, which is very business focused, but this election's too important. That's why I was glad to have you on the show. God bless you, man. Thank you for everything that you've done for Canada and for keeping freedom alive here. And I wish you all the best and all the success.
Appreciate you having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. And that's a wrap.
This episode has been brought to you by eCircleAcademy.com, the proven system to add 6 to 7 figures a year to your thought leader practice.